The sound of the alarm was the first thing that shattered the pristine silence of the private terminal at Oak Ridge Executive Airport. The warning lights inside the cabin of the twin-engine executive helicopter flashed a violent, rhythmic crimson, casting harsh shadows across the hand-stitched leather seats where 6-year-old Leo Sterling sat frozen. The electronic locking mechanism had failed, sealing the heavy composite cabin doors completely from the inside, while an electrical short circuit filled the ventilation system with a thin, acrid stream of pale smoke. Outside, the autumn rain was coming down in relentless sheets, blurring the high-intensity runway lights into long, smeared streaks of yellow and red. Vivian Sterling stood on the tarmac, her $4,000 tailored wool coat completely soaked, her manicured fingers clawing unproductively at the reinforced exterior door handle. For a woman who commanded a multi-billion-dollar global logistics empire, Vanguard Holdings, a woman whose mere entrance into a corporate boardroom could silence 40 seasoned executives, she was suddenly and entirely powerless. Her voice, usually a cold, razor-sharp instrument of absolute command, cracked with raw panic as she banged her palm against the reinforced plexiglass window. Leo was screaming inside, his small hands pressed tightly against his ears, completely overwhelmed by the blaring audio alarm and the trapped smoke swirling around his head. "Break the window," Vivian shouted, turning fiercely toward her chief of aviation operations, Harrison Drake. Drake, immaculate in a designer suit that was now ruined by the storm, stepped back, frantically typing commands into his encrypted company tablet. "Ma'am, it's polycarbonate ballistic glass. A standard emergency hammer won't even crack it without specialized hydraulic rescue tools, and the airport fire crew is currently tied up on the main commercial runway with a hydroplaning private jet. They are at least 10 minutes out." Through the driving rain, a man approached from the shadows of Hangar 4. He walked with a slow, deliberate stride that utterly defied the surrounding chaos. He wore a faded, oil-stained canvas utility jacket with no corporate logo, just a heavy brass zipper and a fraying collar. His face was etched with the quiet, hardened lines of someone who had spent decades under harsh desert suns and cold steel. Holding his left hand tightly was a young girl, Chloe, no older than 7, wearing a bright purple raincoat that was slightly too big for her. She didn't look frightened by the screaming alarms or the shouting adults. She kept her clear green eyes fixed entirely on her father, moving in perfect lockstep with him. Garrett Vance did not run. He stopped 3 feet from the frantic huddle around the malfunctioning aircraft. He took in the entire scene in a single, unhurried glance. The flashing red master caution light, the specific high-pitched whine of the screaming turbine starter, and the pattern of smoke curling from the environmental control unit intake. "Get out of the way," Harrison Drake snapped, shoving his hand out to push Garrett back. "We don't need low-level line mechanics blocking the tarmac. Go find a fire axe, or get the airport manager. This is a proprietary VIP transport, not some crop duster you can just kick into working." Garrett didn't flinch. He didn't even look at Drake. His eyes remained fixed on the weeping boy inside the cabin. He reached down, gently squeezing Chloe's hand. "Stay right here by the luggage cart, sweetheart. Don't move." Chloe nodded solemnly, stepping back into the dry alcove of the hangar door, watching her father with absolute trust. Vivian turned her furious, tear-streaked gaze to Garrett. "Are you deaf? My son is suffocating in there. Do something or get out of my sight." She was trembling, her pristine public facade entirely shattered by the terrifying realization that all her wealth, her immense corporate status, and her private security detail could not open a single locked door to save her child. Garrett stepped past Harrison Drake, his movements smooth and steady, like a mountain anchoring a storm. "He isn't suffocating," Garrett said. His voice was low, deep, and carried a resonant calmness that seemed to cut clean through the howling wind and the screeching alarms. "The smoke you see is a synthetic oil bypass from the auxiliary power unit. It smells terrible, but it's non-toxic. It won't harm him for another 20 minutes. But if your manager keeps hitting that manual digital override panel, he's going to trigger the emergency fire suppression halon tanks, and that will displace the oxygen." Harrison Drake's face went completely pale. He pulled his hand away from the emergency keypad as if the metal had turned white hot. How? How do you know that?" "This is a highly restricted defense-grade civilian avionics package." Garrett did not answer. He reached into the deep pocket of his canvas coat and pulled out a small, unlabeled stainless steel inspection mirror and a thin, L-shaped piece of high-tensile wire tools that looked older than the helicopter itself. He didn't look at the digital keypad. Instead, he crouched down by the lower fuselage junction, right beneath the main rotor transmission fairing, an area no standard commercial mechanics manual ever mentioned as an access point. Vivian watched him, her breath catching in her throat. There was no hesitation in his hands. His fingers, calloused and grease-darkened, moved with a terrifyingly precise, almost artistic fluid grace. He slid the wire into a microscopic weep hole designed for moisture drainage. He closed his eyes, tilting his head slightly, listening not to the chaos around him, but to the internal mechanical heartbeat of the aircraft. For 3 agonizing seconds, the tarmac fell into an absolute breathless silence, save for the weeping of the boy inside. Then, a sharp, clean mechanical click resonated from the belly of the machine. The crimson warning lights instantly died. The heavy composite door swung open smoothly on its hydraulic hinges. Vivian gasped, lunging forward to pull her crying son into her arms, while Harrison Drake stared at Garrett in absolute, tongue-tied shock. Garrett simply stood up, wiped a drop of rain from his forehead with the back of his sleeve, and looked down at his daughter Chloe, who gave him a small, knowing smile. But as Garrett turned to walk away into the shadows of the hangar, Vivian noticed something etched into the weathered brass buckle of his old tool belt, a highly restricted, serialized insignia of the United States Navy's elite experimental flight testing division, a symbol that only a handful of living men were authorized to wear. Vivian held Leo so tightly her knuckles turned white against the damp fabric of his jacket. The little boy's chest heaved with residual sobs, but the fresh air cutting through the open cabin doors was already clearing the faint haze of synthetic smoke. She didn't care about her ruined coat, the freezing rain soaking through her blouse, or the $42 million merger she was supposed to finalize tomorrow morning in Seattle. For the first time in 5 years, the absolute certainty that money could buy total security had vanished, replaced by the terrifying realization of a locked steel box. Harrison Drake stepped forward, his eyes darting from the open door to the minuscule drainage port where Garrett had inserted the wire. His panic was rapidly morphing into professional embarrassment. Mr. Vance, if that is your name, you just performed an unauthorized manipulation of a defense-grade corporate asset. I need to know exactly what manual override bypass you used, and I need your credentials immediately. Vanguard Holdings takes industrial espionage and liability threats extremely seriously. Garrett didn't stop walking toward Hangar 4. He didn't turn around to look at Drake. He simply reached down and adjusted Chloe's hood to shield her face from the shifting wind. The aircraft has a manufacturing defect in the primary solenoid feedback loop, Garrett said, his voice entirely even, carried back over his shoulder. If you turn the battery master on before the internal pressure check completes, the computer assumes a thermal runaway and locks the pneumatic seals. Tell your maintenance crew to check service bulletin 402. They missed it during the last inspection. Drake froze. He knew every line of the fleet's digital logs, and Service Bulletin 402 was a classified manufacturer advisory issued only to military variants of that specific airframe. Before he could demand how a local tarmac mechanic knew a confidential defense serial code, Vivian's voice cut through the rain like a sheet of ice. Harrison, shut up. She stood up slowly, her composure returning like armor sliding back into place. She smoothed down her wet blazer, though her hands were still trembling slightly. She looked at Garrett's back, then down at the small girl in the purple raincoat who was looking back at Leo with genuine, unhurried pity. Chloe pulled a small, brightly painted wooden spinning top from her pocket, the kind carved by hand, smooth and worn from use. She stepped out from the dry alcove, walking right past the imposing form of Harrison Drake, and stopped in front of the weeping boy. Here, Chloe said softly, holding it out. When the sky gets loud, my dad gives me this. If you spin it on the floor, the colors look like a carousel. It makes the noise go away. Leo looked up from his mother's shoulder, his tear-filled eyes locked onto the small wooden toy. Slowly, hesitatingly, he reached out his hand and took it. The crying stopped. The contrast was stark. Vivian had spent millions on advanced therapy and elite private security to keep her son regulated, yet a 7-year-old girl with a wooden toy and a calm voice had done it in 5 seconds. Vivian watched the interaction, an unfamiliar sensation tightening in her throat. She looked at Garrett, who had stopped a few paces back, waiting patiently for his daughter, completely unbothered by the rain or the imposing corporate presence surrounding him. He stood with a quiet masculinity that required no volume, no grand gestures of dominance. I don't believe we've been introduced properly, Vivian said, stepping forward. Her tone was no longer screaming. It was the controlled, razor-sharp voice of an executive who was used to getting answers. I am Vivian Sterling. I own this terminal, that aircraft, and the company that employs every technician on this field. I don't like mysteries, Mr. Vance. Who taught you how to open a restricted military fuselage with a piece of safety wire? Garrett looked at her. Up close, his eyes were a piercing, stormy gray, completely unawed by her title or the immense wealth she radiated. The manual taught me, he said simply. Good night, Miss Sterling. Wait, Vivian commanded, reaching into her leather handbag to pull out a heavy platinum-plated card case. You saved my son from what could have been a catastrophic panic event. Name your price, a permanent position at Vanguard Aerospace, a retainer, a check, whatever the figure is, write it down. Garrett didn't look at the card. He gently placed a hand on Chloe's shoulder, guiding her back toward the dry interior of Hangar 4. It was just one parent helping another, he said, his voice quiet but absolute. The boy is safe. That's the transaction. As they walked away, the stadium lights of the runway caught the brass buckle of his tool belt once more, illuminating the faint, worn engraving of an elite naval squadron. Vivian stood in the downpour, staring after them until the hangar doors clicked shut. She turned sharply to Harrison Drake, her eyes flashing with a dangerous intensity. Get on the phone with corporate intelligence, she whispered, her voice trembling not from fear now, but from an overwhelming, sudden suspicion. I want a complete, unredacted background check on Garrett Vance. Every school, every job, every deployment. A man with those hands doesn't just happen to be fixing old Cessnas in an empty hangar. Drake nodded quickly, already pulling up his encrypted network. But as Vivian looked down at her son, who was now quietly spinning the wooden top on the wet leather seat of the helicopter, she realized something else. The serial number on the malfunctioning helicopter's tail assembly belonged to a highly secretive project her late husband had funded 20 years ago, a project that was supposed to have died in a burning hangar in Nevada. The morning sun broke over Oak Ridge Executive Airport with a crisp, blinding clarity that did nothing to warm the damp November air. Inside the glass-walled perimeter of the Aero Club lounge, the atmosphere was thick with the quiet hum of high-stakes commerce. Billionaires, corporate defense attorneys, and elite private pilots sat in oversized leather chairs, sipping imported espresso while discussing fuel hedges and maritime trade routes. Vivian Sterling sat at the premier corner table, 3 cell phones arranged in a perfect parallel line before her eyes scanning a digital ledger. Beside her, Leo sat in an identical leather chair. He hadn't touched his hot chocolate. Instead, his small fingers were wrapped tightly around the wooden spinning top Chloe had given him the night before. Every few minutes, he would set it on the polished mahogany table and give it a soft twist, watching the painted rings bleed into a soothing, continuous spiral of color. Harrison Drake stepped into the lounge, his jaw tight, carrying a thick manila folder. He didn't sit down. He leaned over the table, his voice a harsh whisper meant to bypass the ears of the surrounding executives. The preliminary background check on Vance came back from corporate security, Vivian. It's a ghost town. The man has no active digital footprint, no credit history for the last 7 years, and his residential address is a leased hangar at the edge of the airfield. He's a nobody living off cash jobs. Vivian didn't look up from her screen. Nobody doesn't open a pressurized Vanguard hull with a piece of safety wire in less than 4 seconds, Harrison. It was a fluke? Drake insisted, his face flush with a mix of irritation and professional pride. I've already ordered the airport authority to revoke his tarmac access badge. He's a liability. In fact, he's down at the main maintenance ramp right now, refusing to sign the standard non-disclosure waiver regarding last night's incident. I'm heading down there with terminal security to have him removed from the property permanently. Vivian's fingers paused over her tablet. A strange, cold sensation settled in her chest. She looked at her son, who was staring out the massive plate glass window down toward the tarmac. Down on the concrete ramp, right beneath the lounge's viewing deck, Garrett Vance stood next to a battered, dual-prop vintage Beechcraft. He was holding a small canvas lunchbox in one hand and Chloe's backpack in the other, preparing to walk her to the airport shuttle line for school. 2 burly, uniformed airport security officers stood blocking his path, flanked by Harrison Drake, who had just descended the exterior staircase. The confrontation drew the immediate attention of the mechanics, corporate pilots, and wealthy aircraft owners lining the hangar row. It was a public execution of a man's livelihood, designed to re-establish the absolute authority of Vanguard Holdings. "You're done here, Vance," Drake announced, his voice carrying clearly across the open tarmac. He reached out, snatching the laminated access badge right off Garrett's canvas jacket, tearing the plastic clip. "Trespassing on proprietary corporate aircraft, operating without an active commercial repair station license, and creating a public hazard. Pack your tools and your kid. You have 30 minutes to clear out of Hangar 4 before we impound everything inside." The surrounding crowd fell entirely silent. Several older mechanics shifted uncomfortably, knowing Garrett was the only man on the field who could balance a turbine by ear, but no one dared speak against the man who carried the seal of the Sterling family empire. Garrett didn't move. He didn't raise his voice, and his posture didn't shift into aggression. He stood entirely grounded, his quiet masculinity drawing a sharp contrast against Drake's loud, defensive posturing. He looked down at the torn plastic badge on the asphalt, then up at Drake. "The Beechcraft belongs to Arthur Pendleton," Garrett said softly, pointing to the vintage aircraft behind him. "The left magneto is grounded out. If he flies it into the overcast today, the engine will fail over the ridge. I'm finishing the timing sequence. I don't care about Pendleton's junk, and I don't care about your amateur diagnostics." Drake sneered, stepping closer, attempting to intimidate the quiet mechanic in front of his peers. "You're an unregistered piece of white noise, Vance. You don't exist in our world. Move, or my officers will carry you off this field." From the glass balcony above, Vivian watched the scene play out. But before she could step forward to intervene, Leo suddenly bolted from her side. The little boy ran past the lounge concierge, threw open the heavy glass exit door, and hurried down the metal staircase toward the tarmac, his small shoes clicking furiously against the steel steps. "Leo, stop!" Vivian cried out, abandoning her phones and her dignity, chasing her son into the cold morning air. Leo didn't stop until he reached the tarmac, pushing past the security guards to stand right beside Chloe. He held out the wooden spinning top, his voice high and remarkably steady for a child who had been screaming in terror just 12 hours prior. "You can't make him leave," Leo said, looking directly at Harrison Drake with a fierce, unexpected bravery. "He fixed the box. He made the bad smoke stop." Chloe looked at Leo, then reached out and took his hand, giving it a gentle, reassuring squeeze. "It's okay," she whispered to him. "My dad knows how to fix the people who are loud, too." Vivian reached the bottom of the stairs, breathless, her heart pounding against her ribs as she pulled Leo back toward her. She looked at Garrett, expecting to see anger, defiance, or fear in his eyes. Instead, she found only that same deep, unshakable calm. It was an expression that made her feel intensely vulnerable, exposing the reality that for all her billions, she could not buy the absolute peace this man carried in his silence. Garrett looked past Vivian, his stormy gray eyes fixing directly on Harrison Drake's custom gold wristwatch, then down at the corporate logo emblazoned on the hangar wall. 20 years ago, Vanguard Aerospace acquired a proprietary patent for a variable displacement hydraulic pump, Garrett said, his voice quiet, but carrying in weight that made Drake's breath catch. The lead engineer died in an accidental hangar explosion in the Nevada desert before the testing logs were finalized. The company claimed the files were lost in the fire, took the insurance payout, and buried the project code. But they didn't lose the files, did they, Harrison? They just couldn't find the man who held the physical master key. Vivian froze, her entire body turning to stone as the words echoed across the tarmac. The Nevada hangar fire was the exact event that had shattered her late husband's first venture, a secret she had spent a decade trying to unravel from the company's locked vaults. Garrett reached into his canvas jacket, pulled out a heavily oxidized titanium wrench, and set it gently on Drake's clipboard. Etched deep into the blackened metal handle was a serial code that matched the secret project files perfectly. "Tell your corporate team that the master key just walked back onto the field," Garrett said smoothly. "Now, get out of my way. I have an engine to time." Harrison Drake stared at the heavy titanium wrench resting on his clipboard as if it were a live explosive. The alphanumeric code engraved into the metal project markers that had supposedly been reduced to ash in a high desert facility 2 decades ago gleamed under the gray morning light. For a man whose entire career was built on maintaining absolute control over Vanguard's operational secrets, the sight of that tool was a devastating blow. His arrogance faltered, replaced by a desperate defensive venom. Security. Detain this man, Drake ordered, his voice losing its polished corporate edge and rising to a sharp, ragged command. He is in possession of stolen proprietary hardware. Confiscate the tool bag immediately. The two airport security guards hesitated, looking from Drake to Vivian Sterling, who remained entirely motionless. Her mind was racing, assembling pieces of a puzzle she had been trying to solve since her husband's passing. She looked at Garrett, trying to find a tremor of fear, a hint of bluffing, or the desperation of a thief. There was none. He stood there with his hands loosely at his sides, an unbothered, mountain-like presence in the center of the gathering crowd. Before the guards could take a single step forward, the high-frequency emergency siren atop Hangar 1 tore through the morning air. It wasn't the standard localized maintenance alert, it was the continuous dual-tone warble of a critical flight line emergency. Every head on the tarmac turned toward the taxiway. Emerging from the low-hanging autumn fog was an ultra-luxury, custom-built experimental executive transport bearing the private insignia of Thorne Global. Inside that aircraft was Dominic Thorne, the primary institutional investor whose approval was completely mandatory for Vivian's upcoming multi-million-dollar corporate merger. The aircraft's port engine was emitting a horrific, uneven metal-on-metal shriek, and a dense, dark column of vapor was spraying violently from the trailing edge of the wing root. "It's a fuel shroud rupture," one of the senior line mechanics shouted, backing away in a sudden panic. "The hot exhaust is going to ignite the atomized mist." The custom transport rolled to a violent, jerking halt right on the central ramp, directly in front of the main lounge deck. The automated emergency exit systems on the aircraft remained dead, its electrical buses clearly shorting out from the internal fluid leak. Through the cockpit glass, the flight crew could be seen frantically cycling switches, trapped inside a multi-million-dollar tinderbox that was seconds away from a catastrophic thermal flash. Harrison Drake immediately grabbed his radio, his face flushed with terror as he realized a disaster of this magnitude on his tarmac would destroy his career forever. "Trigger the secondary foam cannons," he yelled into the microphone, his voice cracking over the static. "Flood the entire intake deck from Hangar 2. Do it now." "No!" Garrett's voice cut through Drake's screaming like a physical barrier. It wasn't loud, but it possessed a terrifying authority that caused the radio operator to freeze. Garrett walked directly over to Drake, his gray eyes dark with a cold, absolute certainty. "If you hit that engine with standard fire suppression foam while the turbine is still spinning at 80% compression, the cold shock will shatter the internal titanium blades. They'll punch straight through the cabin floor like shrapnel. You'll kill everyone inside before the first flame even catches." Drake's hands shook, the radio slipping slightly against his palm. "I am the Director of Aviation Operations here, Vance. You do not dictate emergency protocols to me. We have to suppress the vapor." "You're reacting to what you see, Harrison, not what's happening," Garrett said, his tone perfectly steady, completely devoid of the panic infecting everyone else on the field. He turned smoothly, setting his canvas tool bag on the asphalt. He looked down at Chloe and Leo, who were standing close together by the hangar doors. "Chloe, take Leo inside the lounge office. Keep the doors closed." Chloe grabbed Leo's hand without a single word of protest. "Come on, Leo," she said, her voice a perfect echo of her father's unshakable calm. "My dad's going to fix the big plane now." Vivian watched her son allow himself to be led away, completely trusting the little girl's confidence. She turned back to Garrett, her heart hammering against her ribs. The entire future of her family's empire, and the lives of her closest business allies, were hanging by a thread in the middle of a burning ramp. "Garrett," she said, using his first name for the very first time, her voice trembling with an elite woman's rare vulnerability. "Please, help them." Garrett didn't waste a second. He didn't ask for a contract, a waiver, or an apology. He grabbed a single, specialized, brass-headed mallet and a manual pressure-venting key from his bag. While the rest of the ground crew fled toward the safety monitors, Garrett walked directly toward the shrieking, vapor-shrouded aircraft, stepping straight into the path of the dangerous fuel mist. Drake screamed into his radio for security to stop him, but the guards refused to move, paralyzed by the sheer terror of the unfolding crisis and the undeniable bravery of the lone mechanic. Garrett reached the belly of the experimental transport. The heat radiating from the cowling was intense enough to warp the air, and the atomized fuel was soaking his canvas jacket. He didn't look at the external digital diagnostics, which were flashing error codes. He placed his bare left hand flat against the pressurized hydraulic access panel, using his physical touch to read the internal vibrations of the dying machine. With two rapid, perfectly placed strikes of his brass mallet against the primary bypass valve, followed by a swift quarter turn of his manual venting key, Garrett completely bypassed the locked digital computer. A massive, deafening hiss of pressurized nitrogen shot straight into the air, safely venting the explosive fuel away from the glowing turbine core. The metal shriek abruptly died. The engine spun down into a quiet, harmless whistle. The heavy pneumatic cabin doors popped open with a clean hydraulic hiss, and the emergency ground crews finally rushed forward with their cooling blankets. Dominic Thorne, a powerful, silver-haired billionaire who was feared across 3 continents, stumbled out of the cabin, coughing slightly but entirely unharmed. He looked at the cooling engine, then at the frantic ground crews, and finally his eyes landed on Garrett, who was already walking back toward his tool bag, wiping his grease-stained hands on his old gray rag. Thorne walked past Harrison Drake as if the operations chief were invisible, marching straight toward Vivian Sterling. Vivian, the older billionaire, breathed, his voice rich with shock. Your ground system failed completely. If it wasn't for this man right here understanding the manual nitrogen bypass of a prototype system, my entire board would be dead on your tarmac. Thorne turned to look at Garrett, his eyes widening in a sudden, shocking moment of recognition. He stared at the weathered lines of Garrett's face, then at the old titanium wrench still resting on Drake's abandoned clipboard. Wait a minute, Thorne whispered, his voice dropping all of its elite posture. Vance? Garrett Vance? You're the chief developmental test pilot from the Nevada evaluation team. They told us you died in the hangar fire 20 years ago. Dominic Thorne's words seemed to hang suspended in the damp, heavy air of the tarmac. The murmurs from the gathered mechanics and elite spectators stopped instantly. The only sound left was the ticking of the cooling, silent turbine engines of the Thorne Global Transport and the steady, rhythmic patter of the rain against the concrete. Harrison Drake's face went from pale to a deep mottled red. He stepped between Thorne and Garrett, his hands raised in a placating gesture that looked entirely hollow. Mr. Thorne, please, you've just been through a highly traumatic aviation incident. The fumes, the shock. You're confusing this line mechanic with a military contractor from decades ago. Garrett Vance is a local trespasser with no accredited background. Thorne didn't look at Drake. He pushed the younger executive's hand away with a cold, aristocratic contempt. He kept his sharp, piercing gaze locked directly onto Garrett's face. I don't forget the man who saved my life in the Mojave, and I certainly don't forget the face of the finest developmental pilot the Navy ever produced. Look at his left wrist, Harrison. Look at the scar across the radius. Garrett didn't hide his hands. He stood perfectly still, his canvas coat dark with the atomized fuel mist he had just braved to save the aircraft. The cuff of his sleeve had ridden up slightly, revealing a thick, jagged silvery line of scar tissue running from his wrist halfway up his forearm, the unmistakable mark of a severe thermal injury that had been repaired by field surgeons. It's just an old burn, Mr. Thorne, Garrett said, his voice dropping into that deep, quiet register that refused to match the frantic energy of the billionaires around him. The nitrogen lines are clear. Your flight crew can safely exit now. You should have your maintenance team haul this airframe into Hangar 1 to inspect the lower manifold before you attempt to cycle the electronics again. Garrett, listen to me, Thorne said, stepping closer, his elite posture completely dropping away. Vanguard reported your death. They filed the federal loss reports. They claimed the entire prototype dataset for the variable displacement system was destroyed in that hangar fire. Arthur Sterling took the company public on the back of those insurance waivers and the subsequent repatenting. If you are alive, then the foundational assets of Vanguard Holdings are built on an international fraud. The silence that followed was suffocating. Vivian Sterling felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. The multi-billion-dollar empire she commanded, the legacy she was trying to secure for her son Leo, the massive merger she was supposed to sign tomorrow, it was all tied to a single night in a Nevada desert 20 years ago. A night her late husband had never spoken about. She looked at Garrett, her breathing shallow, her hands clenching into tight fists inside her coat pockets. She had everything money could buy. Yet standing in front of this quiet man in a grease-stained jacket, she felt completely stripped of her power. Is it true? Vivian whispered, her voice cracking, breaking through her cold corporate exterior. She walked past Drake, stepping directly into the wet perimeter of the engine deck until she was standing just 2 feet from Garrett. My husband, Arthur. Did he know you were alive? Garrett looked at her. There was no hatred in his gray eyes, no thirst for vengeance, no bitter satisfaction at seeing the head of Vanguard Holdings crumble on a public tarmac. There was only a profound, grounded sorrow that seemed to carry the weight of 20 years of exile. Arthur knew, Garrett said softly. He knew because he was the one who handed me the master key before the doors were locked from the outside. Before Vivian could process the devastating weight of his words, a sleek black convoy of 3 armored utility vehicles tore through the perimeter gates of the airport, their tires screeching against the wet asphalt. They slammed to a halt in a perfect tactical formation around the maintenance ramp, cutting off Hangar 4 entirely. The doors threw open, and 8 heavily armed, private corporate security operatives wearing the dark gray tactical uniforms of Vanguard Global Security stepped out, led by a tall, razor-thin man with a military haircut and a cold, dead expression. His name was Victor Cross, the head of Vanguard's black-budget internal security division, a man who answered only to the executive board. Harrison Drake immediately straightened up, a desperate, triumphant smile flashing across his face. "Victor! Thank God. We have a severe security breach. This individual, Vance, has manipulated proprietary military hardware and is making fraudulent claims against the corporation. Take him into custody and secure his leased hangar immediately." The security guards moved with practiced efficiency, their heavy boots slamming against the tarmac as they formed a tight, aggressive circle around Garrett. The surrounding mechanics backed away rapidly, terrified of the corporate muscle that had just descended on the field. Garrett didn't flinch. His posture didn't change. But his eyes immediately darted toward the glass doors of the lounge office 50 yards away, where Chloe and Leo were looking out through the rain-streaked window. The warmth in his expression vanished, replaced by a terrifying, quiet, protective focus. The quiet masculinity that had defined him all morning suddenly hardened into something incredibly lethal. "Vivian," Garrett said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a resonance that made Victor Cross pause his advance. "Tell your men to step back. My daughter is watching." Vivian looked from the armed operatives to the window, seeing her own son Leo holding Chloe's hand tightly inside the office. She saw the absolute terror on her child's face, not because of the aircraft danger, but because of the violent men her own company had just brought to the field. She looked at Garrett, whose steady strength was the only thing keeping the entire tarmac from erupting into a bloodbath. She realized then, with a crushing clarity, that her wealth had bought her an army of monsters, but it had never bought her a single moment of real safety. "Cross, stand down," Vivian commanded, her voice rising to its full authoritative power, though her hands were shaking violently. "Stand down right now." Victor Cross didn't move. He kept his eyes fixed on Garrett, his hand resting on the holster at his hip. "With all due respect, Miss Sterling, Corporate Protocol 99 is active. A threat to the core patent integrity of Vanguard Holdings overrides local executive command. We are securing the asset and the individual for transport to the corporate headquarters in Seattle." Harrison Drake sneered, stepping behind the line of armed guards. "You're a ghost, Vance. And ghosts don't get to ruin a $42 million merger." Garrett slowly took one step forward, placing himself directly between the armed guards and the office window where the children were waiting. He let out a slow, even breath, his fingers tightening around the heavy titanium wrench in his hand. "You're right about one thing, Harrison," Garrett whispered, his gray eyes flashing like a lightning strike in the winter fog. "Ghosts don't ruin mergers. They finish the flight." Victor Cross took a single, measured step forward, his hand wrapping tightly around the grip of his sidearm. His operatives moved with him, their boots clicking in unison against the wet asphalt, forming an unbreakable perimeter around the lone mechanic. The atmosphere on the tarmac grew so dense with tension that the air itself felt heavy, smelling faintly of cold rain and volatile aviation fuel. Vivian Sterling lunged forward, placing her body directly between Cross's weapon and Garrett Vance. Her polished corporate armor had completely fallen away, leaving her exposed, her face wet with rain and tears. "Victor, if you draw that weapon on my airfield, I will personally dismantle your entire division by nightfall," she snarled, her voice shaking with an unprecedented raw emotion. "Look at the window. Look at my son. I will not allow you to turn this place into a war zone." Cross didn't lower his hand. His expression remained entirely blank, the cold, detached gaze of a man who evaluated human lives strictly by corporate asset values. "The board signed the directive 3 minutes ago, Miss Sterling. The appearance of a deceased project lead carrying classified military prototypes represents an existential threat to the upcoming merger. We are clearing the field. Harrison Drake backed away toward the safety of the armored vehicles, a smug, vindictive grin breaking across his face. It's over, Vance. You should have stayed dead in Nevada. You're outgunned, outfunded, and entirely trapped. Garrett did not run. He didn't tighten his grip on the heavy titanium wrench, nor did his posture shift into a defensive crouch. Instead, he let out a long, slow breath, looking directly past the armed operatives toward the digital clipboard Drake had abandoned on a nearby luggage cart. You always did focus too much on the security of the perimeter, Harrison, and not enough on the architecture of the network, Garrett said. His voice was remarkably quiet, yet it carried a strange, resonant weight that seemed to cut clean through the howling wind. Drake blinked, his grin faltering. What are you talking about? That old titanium wrench, Garrett said, nodding slightly toward the tool resting on the cart. The handle isn't just engraved with a serial code. The core of the alloy is embedded with a high-frequency passive transponder. 20 years ago, the military evaluation team required a physical failsafe to prevent Vanguard from burying the flight logs. The moment you placed that wrench onto a Vanguard encrypted digital clipboard, the integrated scanning bed read the internal RFID tag. A sharp, high-pitched electronic chime suddenly echoed from Drake's abandoned clipboard. The screen flared from standard corporate blue to a violent, flashing amber. Simultaneously, a massive collective gasp rippled through the crowd of mechanics and spectators lining the hangar doors. Up inside the glass-walled Aero Club lounge, every single flight information display, every television monitor, and every executive tablet suddenly flickered violently. The glossy advertisements for Vanguard Holdings vanished. In their place, rows of dense, scrolling military flight telemetry data, old engineering schematics, and unredacted accident reports began to populate the screens in real time, accompanied by a bright red header, Federal Aviation Oversight Mandatory Disclosure Notice. Dominic Thorne let out a sudden, harsh bark of a laugh, his silver hair catching the light as he stepped forward, staring up at the massive lounge displays. An automated digital deadman switch. You absolute fools. He didn't just walk onto your field with a wrench. He just initiated a global broadcast of the original Nevada project logs straight to the Federal Aviation Administration and the Department of Defense mainframe. The armed security guards stopped completely, their tactical discipline fracturing as they looked up at the giant hangar screens, displaying classified blueprints that bore Arthur Sterling's original signature, alongside the words, "Property of Chief Test Pilot Garrett Vance." Victor Cross's earpiece suddenly crackled with a violent, distorted burst of static. The voice of the chief executive officer, screaming from the corporate headquarters in Seattle, was so loud it could be heard by everyone standing on the wet concrete. Cross. Abort the directive. Abort right now. The federal compliance servers just locked down our entire trading portfolio. Pull your men back. Cross's hand slowly drifted away from his weapon. His face remained pale, his eyes locked onto Garrett with a sudden, profound realization of who he was actually dealing with. This wasn't a broken, low-level line mechanic hiding in a leased hangar. This was the master architect of the entire system they had spent 2 decades trying to control. The power on the tarmac reversed instantly and completely. Harrison Drake stumbled backward against the side of an armored vehicle, his tablet dropping from his trembling hands and shattering against the wet ground. The public humiliation was absolute. Before the very eyes of his peers, his subordinates, and the most powerful investors in the country, his entire career had been reduced to a fragile, desperate lie. Through the heavy silence that followed, the door to the lounge office slowly swung open. Chloe stepped out onto the concrete, her small purple raincoat bright against the gray afternoon. She wasn't looking at the armed guards or the flashing monitors. She walked straight over to her father, reaching up to slide her small hand into his calloused palm. The loud men stopped talking. "Dad," Chloe said softly, her clear green eyes looking up at him with absolute, unshakable pride. "Can we go finish the timing on Mr. Pendleton's plane now?" Garrett looked down at his daughter, the terrifying, lethal intensity in his eyes instantly melting away into a profound, gentle warmth. He squeezed her hand gently. "Yeah, sweetheart, let's go finish the job." Vivian stood entirely frozen, watching the lone father and daughter turn their backs on the multi-billion-dollar corporate empire without a single backward glance. She looked down at her hands, realizing that for all her immense wealth, she had never witnessed a strength as terrifyingly complete as the silence of Garrett Vance. The black armored utility vehicles retreated from the tarmac with the same frantic urgency with which they had arrived, their tires spraying plumes of gray rainwater as they sped through the security gates. The vanguard of private operatives was gone, leaving behind an absolute ringing silence. Harrison Drake remained standing near the leaking transport, his expensive leather shoes submerged in a puddle of fuel-tainted water, his chest heaving as he stared down at the shattered remains of his digital tablet. Vivian Sterling didn't look at him. She didn't offer a reprimand or demand his resignation. The silence she gave him was far more lethal than any corporate execution. She simply turned her back on her director of operations, her eyes tracking the steady, unhurried forms of Garrett and Chloe Vance as they walked back into the yawning shadow of Hangar 4. Dominic Thorne stepped up beside Vivian, his silver hair completely damp, his sharp face softened by a rare expression of profound respect. "The board meeting tomorrow morning is irrelevant now, Vivian," the older billionaire said, his voice quiet but steady. "Vanguard Holdings isn't facing a merger. You're facing a total reckoning. But if I were you, I wouldn't worry about the SEC servers. I'd worry about the man in that hangar. He holds the truth your husband spent a lifetime trying to bury." Vivian didn't answer. She reached down, took Leo's hand, and felt how warm and steady it was. The boy wasn't shaking anymore. He was looking toward Hangar 4, his eyes wide with a quiet, calm curiosity that Vivian hadn't seen in him since his father passed away. Inside Hangar 4, the atmosphere was entirely different from the high-stakes chaos of the tarmac. The air was warm, smelling of vintage machinery, clean motor oil, and dry wood. A single, heavy, incandescent work light hung from the rafters, casting a soft amber glow over Arthur Pendleton's vintage dual-prop Beechcraft. Garrett was already back under the left engine cowl, a mechanical pencil tucked behind his ear, his fingers moving methodically along the vintage magneto housing as if the corporate storm outside had never occurred. Chloe had already returned to her folding table in the corner, her purple raincoat draped neatly over the back of a chair. She opened her library book, her small face completely at peace. Vivian stepped through the small side door of the hangar, her heels clicking softly against the swept concrete floor. For a woman who spent her life walking into rooms designed to intimidate others, she felt completely small in this space. She was acutely aware of her damp, ruined clothing, her smudged makeup, and the hollow weight of her multi-billion-dollar title. Leo immediately broke away from her side, walking quietly over to Chloe's table. He didn't say anything. He just pulled the wooden spinning top from his pocket and set it gently on the edge of the wood. Chloe looked up, gave him a small, welcoming smile, and pointed to the empty stool beside her. Leo sat down, his small frame instantly relaxing into the quiet rhythm of her space. Vivian watched them, her hand lifting to her throat as a profound, rare vulnerability washed over her. She had spent millions on elite child psychologists, sensory-safe environments, and high-end retreats to find a way to give Leo a sense of peace, yet this man and his daughter provided it without even trying. The stark realization settled deep into her chest. She had everything money could buy, except peace. Garrett rolled out from beneath the engine bay on a wooden creeper board. He stood up smoothly, wiping his hands on his familiar gray rag. He didn't look at her with accusation or triumph. His stormy gray eyes were completely grounded, offering a steady, protective strength that required no volume. "You should get the boy out of those damp clothes, miss." "Sterling," Garrett said softly, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the hangar. "There's a small electric heater in the office break room. I can make a fresh pot of coffee if you need a minute." Vivian closed her eyes for a brief second, her hands trembling slightly as she tucked them into her pockets to hide the movement. "Why didn't you come forward, Garrett?" she asked, her voice dropping into a raw, emotional whisper that she had never used in a corporate setting. 20 years. You let everyone believe you died in that fire. You let my husband build an empire on your designs while you lived in a leased hangar fixing old planes for cash. Why? Garrett looked down at the weathered gray rag in his hands, his face tracing a memory that clearly carried a heavy weight. Arthur wanted to scale the variable displacement system for defense contracts, Garrett said, his quiet masculinity absolute in the stillness. He wanted to put it on unmanned combat drones. I built that system to keep transport pilots alive in high-altitude failures, not to automate the destruction of people who can't see the sky. He paused, looking over at Chloe, his expression softening into an immense, protective warmth. The night the hangar burned, Arthur realized the military oversight team wouldn't let me back out of the contract. So he helped me disappear. He told the board the prototypes were lost, and he took the insurance payout to protect my survival. I chose this life because it was the only way to ensure my daughter grew up knowing her father's hands were clean. Vivian felt a tear slip down her cheek, cold against her skin. The narrative she had believed for 2 decades, the tragic loss of a brilliant military team, the heroic corporate resurrection led by her late husband was completely shattered. Her entire life's work was built on a sacrifice she had never understood. She walked closer to him, stopping just a foot away, the distance between her corporate wealth and his emotional security completely vanishing. She looked into his steady gray eyes, noticing for the first time the faint, fine lines of laughter and sorrow etched around his brow. "The federal servers are going to dismantle Vanguard, Garrett," Vivian whispered, her voice trembling. "They are going to review every patent, every contract, every dollar. I don't know how to protect my son from the collapse of everything we own." Garrett reached out, his large, calloused hand hovering for a fraction of a second before he gently placed it on her trembling shoulder. The touch was firm, steady, and carried an incredible, unembellished warmth that instantly anchored her panic. "You don't protect him by saving the Empire, Vivian," Garrett said softly, using her first name with a deliberate, comforting calm. "You protect him by showing him what's worth keeping when the noise finally stops." Vivian looked down at his hand on her shoulder, her breathing slowing, the terrifying weight of the corporate world outside fading into absolute insignificance. But just as the quiet understanding between them began to deepen, the sudden, sharp wail of a police cruiser's siren echoed from the main airport taxiway, accompanied by the heavy, rhythmic thumping of a low-flying federal helicopter descending directly toward Hangar 4. The wash of blinding searchlights swept across the pristine concrete floor of Hangar 4, completely obliterating the soft amber glow of the incandescent work light. The roaring downwash of a twin-rotor federal helicopter rattled the corrugated steel walls, kicking up loose autumn leaves outside the wide-open bay doors. Harrison Drake, who had been lingering on the edge of the tarmac like a ghost of his former corporate self, suddenly found his second wind. He sprinted toward the landing zone, waving his arms frantically at the descending aircraft. "Over here! The suspect is inside Hangar 4. He's armed with proprietary military hardware and has compromised our national security infrastructure servers." The helicopter settled with a heavy metallic thump. The side doors slid open immediately, and instead of the gray tactical uniforms of Vanguard's private security detail, out stepped 6 federal agents wearing the dark navy windbreakers of the Department of Justice and the Federal Aviation Administration's Enforcement Division. Leading them was a sharp-eyed, graying man carrying a federal warrant cylinder. His name was Director Nolan Kincaid. Drake scrambled in behind them, pointing a trembling finger at Garrett. "There he is! Secure his tools! The man is an absolute fraud!" Director Kincaid walked past the screaming operations chief as if the man were nothing more than a localized weather disturbance. He marched directly into Hangar 4, his heavy boots echoing in the warm, enclosed space. 2 federal agents followed him, their expressions grim and absolute. Kincaid stopped 5 feet from Garrett. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't reach for handcuffs. Instead, he pulled his hands from his pockets, looked at the weathered, grease-stained lines of Garrett's face, and slowly raised his right hand to the brim of his cap in a crisp, deeply respectful military salute. "Commander Vance," Kincaid said, his voice carrying the immense authority of the federal government. "It's been 20 years. The Pentagon servers just received your telemetry upload. The Inspector General has issued an emergency injunction against the entire executive board of Vanguard Holdings." Harrison Drake's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked from the saluting federal agent to the quiet mechanic holding a gray rag. "Commander? No, you don't understand. He's an unregistered line mechanic. He lives in a leased hangar." Kincaid turned his head slightly, his gaze dropping onto Drake with utter disgust. "Mr. Drake, you are under arrest for federal procurement fraud, systematic obstruction of justice, and the intentional suppression of military flight safety protocols. Take him away." Before Drake could even protest, the 2 agents stepped forward, clicked heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists, and marched him out into the cold rain. The public reversal was complete. The man who had tried to erase Garrett Vance from existence was now being carried off the field in chains, completely broken in front of the very mechanics he had spent years underestimating. Director Kincaid looked back at Garrett, then at Vivian, who was standing quietly beside the vintage Beechcraft. "The Vanguard merger is permanently frozen, Miss Sterling. The Department of Justice is seizing the proprietary patent vault in Seattle. But the government acknowledges that the original intellectual property belongs entirely to the man standing next to you. Commander Vance is, as of 10 minutes ago, the legally recognized owner of the variable displacement technology." Garrett stepped forward, his quiet masculinity grounding the entire room. Thank you, Nolan. The files are complete. The failsafe worked exactly the way Arthur and I designed it to. Use the data to retrofit the commercial transport fleet. Keep the pilot safe. That's all I ever wanted. Kincaid nodded solemnly. The Navy owes you a debt we can never fully repay, sir. If you ever want to come back to the testing program, your desk is waiting. Garrett looked down at Chloe, who had walked over to stand by his side, her small hand sliding easily into his. I already have the only job that matters, Nolan. The federal director smiled softly, saluted once more, and led his team out of the hangar. The heavy bay doors were slowly rolled shut by the local airport mechanics, who stood guard outside, ensuring their elite brother would finally have the peace he deserved. The silence returned to Hangar 4, warmer and deeper than before. The massive weight of a 20-year corporate lie had been lifted, leaving only the clean, honest smell of vintage iron and the quiet safety of the family space. Vivian walked over to the folding table. She looked down at Leo, who was carefully showing Chloe how to make the wooden spinning top balance on the edge of a technical manual. There was no anxiety left in her son's eyes. The boy looked up at her and said, "Mom, can we stay here for a while? It's quiet." Vivian felt a warmth in her chest that she hadn't experienced in years. She looked at Garrett, the emotional contrast between them finally dissolving into something rare and genuine. She had built an empire out of steel and numbers, but this man had built a sanctuary out of truth and calm. "Vanguard is going to change, Garrett," Vivian said softly, her voice carrying a deep, emotional respect. "I am going to use my remaining shares to dissolve the defense contracts completely. We are going to build a new foundation centered entirely on aviation safety and underfunded engineering education. I want to build what my husband and you originally dreamed of." She paused, her hands slipping out of her coat pockets, her posture completely open to him for the first time. "But I don't know how to run a company that values people over assets. I need someone who understands the architecture of the system. I need a partner." Garrett looked at her sideways, a slow, genuine smile finally breaking across his weathered face. It wasn't the arrogant smirk of a corporate executive. It was the warm, grounded expression of a man who had survived the storm and found the shore. "That sounds like a very long-form project, Vivian," Garrett said softly, his deep voice carrying a gentle, unmistakable promise. "I have all the time in the world," she replied, her eyes locked onto his stormy gray gaze. Outside, the cold November rain finally cleared, revealing a vast, deep blue Southern California twilight. The valley beyond the hangar door was silent, the long equations of the past 20 years finally settling into a perfect, beautiful resolution. Chloe patted Leo's shoulder as the wooden top spun perfectly in the center of the table, its painted carousel of colors moving fast, yet remaining entirely, beautifully at peace.